and we're back for episode 23 of Pursuing the Perfect Pint podcast. And as you all know, Brent is a huge fan of the barley farmer, as we all should be. So this week's episode is about the untold farmer story, malting barley's important role in beer and whiskey.
Yep. Episode 23, as you said, Danielle, a topic very dear to my heart. So, and it'll come up as well. But I think there's a lot more we can do in this space of telling the story. But we'll get into that as we get into the episode.
So before we dive into that, Brent, another interesting week. Certainly here in the UK, we still haven't seen any rain. I don't know what it's looking like in the rest of Western Europe from a rainfall perspective.
Yeah, I published the journal last week. So in that, I used AI to create a little image, which was really a past photo I had of me presenting at a previous event, and I overlapped that to make it look like I was a weather person, because I really feel like this time of year we're entirely focused on weather. So yeah, I think you're right, Danielle. There has been rain, so I guess I would say generally across the board, things are better this week than they were 2 weeks ago in Europe in general. So rain in France. So for example, as a proxy, in a way, 80% of the French wheat crop is rated as good to excellent, which is, and barley wouldn't be so different from that sense. So I think the rain has arrived more in France than you've got. So I think, UK's got some dry areas. Maybe parts of Scandinavia could use some moisture, but on the whole, I think we've seen things improve in the last 2 weeks. So that's been good. Prices were actually starting to fall as a result of that. But now at the time of recording this, the other geopolitical thing that we also seem to talk about every single podcast, I hope at some point soon it goes away, but it doesn't appear to be. A week ago, if we were doing this, we would have thought a peace deal was sounding like it was getting pretty close. But now in the last days, this week has started, and the deal's fallen apart, and there's been escalation of tensions in the Middle East. So I think we're further away today, being Monday, than we were last week. So I guess we can be prepared for more disruption coming from the geopolitical Middle East perspective. So far, it hasn't really changed grain prices. So barley is kind of malting barley is kind of steady at the moment, but the fact that it hasn't come to a peace deal is going to leave all those things we talked about endlessly: inflation cost for farmers, and fertilizer, and freight cost, and fuel charges, and so on. So we're stuck in this cycle. We just keep going around and around, and nothing has really resolved.
A bit of a sort of sad version of Groundhog Day.
Yep, and we're running out of time, in the sense like there'll be fertilizer to apply in crops that are being planted in North America and South America, Argentina, Australia. So the disruption will actually, more than what it could potentially do, it actually will soon start to move into it. It's going to have a meaningful impact, and where it comes back to. So anyone listening, if you're a brewer and you're wondering what your cost of ingredients would be going forward, this is inflationary if it doesn't resolve itself pretty soon, because farmers will be looking at their price expectations going forward. So we've got some challenges, I think.
And Brent, how does barley, from a fertilizer usage perspective, compare to other crops?
Well, that's a good question. Like barley, from an inputs perspective, barley is actually a lower input requirement. So there would be a school of thought that says in parts of the world there could be a minor. This would be very minor because farmer rotations are more or less established. But on the fringe, you could see little changes, like maybe a farmer plants barley instead of spring wheat in some parts of the world. So you could, or maybe less special crops and maybe a bit more barley, because there is that input saving. So, but not major, but on the fringe, as I say, you could see minor movement over to barley because of that input differential.
Well, Brent, so we look forward to next week to see if we're discussing the same thing again, or if things have moved on in some fashion.
At some point we will have to be right. At some
Yeah.
point it'll end and we'll see things calm down
Yeah.
and maybe we did touch on it. The last thing market related, which is the positive, we saw the last of the big three global brewers report their Q1 results,
Yes.
and we had AB InBev at
With volume growth as well.
a positive
Yeah.
1.2% quarter on top of Carlsberg and Heineken were mildly positive. So anything that's a green number above zero, that's a
Yeah.
massive win. As we saw in Lisbon, I think we will this year, if we can achieve a 0.5 to a 1% growth, we should have a small parade because we've been through 3 years of decline. So I think Q1 behind us, and that is indicating a little bit of a movement in a good direction. Of course, we need to wait for summer, and that'll be the main driver, but a little bit of positive news has come through.
Absolutely. And so let's move on then, Brent, to hearing from some farmers in North America to see what they have to say based on their discussion with you at the conference.
Well, we are gathered again. We have our friends that had just arrived here in Lisbon from the U.S., from various parts of the Midwest. So Steve, Nathan, and Frank, welcome to Lisbon.
Thank you.
Great to catch up with you. We had, for those that are listening, we had a very good summit in Denver in 2025, and we thought it was very important, and it was very effective in the end. We think it's important from RMI's perspective that we need to make sure that we get the farmer's perspective in the events that we do, and to speak this week, which is going to be part of it, along with a farmer from Sweden. So we haven't given up on the importance of getting this farmer stories, because as you guys, I use it, and I think I've got your permission, but the no barley, no beer motto is alive and well in Lisbon this week. It's in my presentation. And I guess the first thing we talked about is from a crop 25 perspective, my sense is you had a pretty reasonable outcome, but maybe we could talk, Frank, you start and say, what was your result in
I would say
2025?
in my area, Southwest North Dakota, we kind of started out dry, but the crop actually turned out to be average, a little above average. Quality was good. Can't complain about that. Contracting was pretty typical, even though North Dakota's acres are up a little bit in 25, but I would say overall there's an average to a little above, I would say, where we're at.
And Nathan, you're in?
I would say the same thing. We don't have near as much barley growing in our area as we used to. Kind of more in north central North Dakota. Our acres have kind of shifted south and east from us. But the barley that was grown was really good. Yields were good. Quality was good. Growing conditions were pretty favorable, dry at times, but overall yields were good. So far the test looked like it's going to make malt. We haven't delivered any yet. We're still waiting to get some grain dried down, but I think overall it's going to be a pretty successful crop.
I think the quality will stand up. So
Yeah, it appears so. Yeah.
What in your thoughts, Steve?
Yeah, visiting with the growers, across the state after harvest, and you've always got your little pockets where there's a sprout issue or a disease issue, but they were pretty much concluded that what Nathan and Frank have been saying, that yields, a little bit above average, actually pretty decent. Quality seems to be holding better than anticipated, because, I'll go back to like our county rep meeting last July, weeks before harvest, and everybody was fingers crossed. It looks okay. I think we're in a good spot here. Let's, try to bring the harvest in. So, overall, not that bad of a year.
And you touched on it, Frank. The area in North Dakota was up slightly, but that was mainly a correction because it had been reduced quite a bit in 24. So there was a bit of a correction that came through. The bigger picture is beer volumes are down in the U.S., so the need for malt and therefore malting. So I guess you're fortunate in the sense that you had a bit of that rebound, which means other parts of the U.S. will have felt more of a downturn in planted area, and production would be lower. So you guys are a bit of the exception, if I say it that way.
I would say you're pretty correct on that, because mostly for ingredient suppliers for barley, we contract crops. So in 2024, contracts were kind of lower for volumes, and that kind of hit not just North Dakota, but pretty much the whole barley growing region. And in 25, we actually had a little uptake, so that helped North Dakota out. Not many other states were up, so it did kind of, hopefully it's not just a correction. We stay steady and not rise a little, but we'll see how that goes on
Well, you've mentioned it a couple times now, Frank. So when I look at the bigger picture of the world and the model that operates in the U.S., so the contracting model that you mentioned is something that I think is likely going to expand, because we see other parts of the world where the premium, so the premium paid to farmers for growing malting barley versus feed barley, has got very narrow, which is not a very good message to send to farmers. Is really saying, thanks for growing malting barley, but I'm not going to pay you much for it, right? And if that happens often enough, if I was a farmer, I would get pretty demotivated in that whole thing. And part of the way that's been addressed in the U.S. is the contracting that you mentioned is you're not going to plant it if you don't have a contract.
Absolutely.
Right?
It's kind of a typical, unless there's a chance for feed or rolling at a bale, sometimes people use it for cover crop. That's really typically the only other avenue for it right now.
Which gets back to, as we were kind of chatting about this before, barley is a niche or specialty crop, you would call it, and there's nothing wrong with calling it that, but it comes with some needs that you would have from a farmer's perspective. You need that contract, you need the terms in that contract to be something that you could be comfortable with, that you're not bearing all the risk that Mother Nature throws at you, or it rains or it doesn't rain, demand goes down and someone doesn't take your barley. Those things are now embedded in the contract, because you need some of those assurances as farmers to stay bought in to the program.
The farmers need it, and the industry needs it too. They need assurances that product will be out there, because if they don't go out and contract, then they're not going to have their product as well. So those contract programs are good for the farmer. It gives us an opportunity to price grain, put something on our sales, and lock in some prices. But it also allows that maltster to have a guaranteed volume to run through their plants.
And it's important to note too that the importance of the contracting program. You realize it's a purchasing document, it's a pricing document, it's a legal document, but it's also a communication tool. Let's say, for lack of a better term, stimulates that annual communication between the grower as the raw ingredient supplier to the malt house. That well, here are the parameters. Here's the pricing. Here are the specifications. Can you meet those under these guidelines? Well, because of competitive factors, no, we can't, or yes, we can, whatever it is. But just it does help with the communication at that level, which is important to note.
Yeah, because and ultimately it is a commercial discussion.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? It's a commercial discussion, and not to say it doesn't happen in other parts of the world, because farmers will say, which variety should I grow and what's demand looking like and so on. But it hasn't matured to the same level where it actually ends up in a contract prior to planting, right? Which is what you guys operate off of.
Exactly.
And I'm not saying it's widespread, but I kind of see things progressing in that direction, certainly in some parts of the world. Otherwise, I just don't think farmers will blindly plant malting barley just because they've always done it. Like I think there's a conscious review every year, to your point, Steve.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't fit, then you'll grow other crops, or if you want barley, but maybe you grow feed barley.
There's a lot of farmers that use that as their rotation. That's part of it, but there is other options. So it's always something that whatever works for your arsenal that year.
We have an option of 7 or 8 different crops we can grow.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
I mean, it's we grow it because it's profitable and it works for us, but there's other crops out there that work as well too. So.
Yeah. Well, we will have that discussion this week. We aren't going to solve all the world's problems this week, but we're certainly going to try. When we take all that into account, this week our theme is building a resilient malt supply chain for 2035. So by design, what are we going to do in the decade ahead? I guess maybe with your farmer hats on, we'll start with you, Frank. Like what is the sort of thing that you see? And when I mentioned to you, like the decade ahead, what are the things that come to mind to say, what's going to help the industry be successful, taking into account your perspective from a farm?
Just in the barley avenue?
Yeah, just in malting barley.
Just in barley avenue, I would say that for a decade ahead, consumers need to drink more beer. There's no doubt of that. Hopefully that'll kind of gotta show that beer is actually better and healthier for you than for you to drink cocktails. But as from the farm standpoint, solidifying your contracting from the industry to make sure everybody's happy, start with, and there's no question on supply, no question on when they need it for demand, and just keep rolling and have that communication, like Steve said earlier, with the industry to the ingredient suppliers, that everything's going to be kosher and smooth, and hopefully we sustain where we're at.
Yeah. And maybe add to that, and then we'll get to the other two here as well. But and what is your level of optimism about the decade ahead if you think about malting barley and growing malting barley?
My optimism is that it's an up and down market like pretty much every other crop. So hopefully we're on the curve of the bottom and we're coming back up, or at least slightly increase and keep going. So I have optimism. I think we can get there. It's just, you don't know when we're going to hit, and it all depends on.
Nathan, your thoughts? Decade ahead, optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, there's opportunities. I mean, we're seeing barley and malt move around the globe a lot easier and faster than I would ever imagine. Mexico and some of those supply chains that I guess weren't even on the radar a decade ago. So we're seeing barley move differently than we ever have. So that's concerning, no doubt. From the U.S. side, I mean, say most of it's used domestically. Hopefully our consumption comes around and stay, steady. But yeah, and from the farmer's specific perspective, the next 10 years, I just see competing crops as our biggest issue. I mean, the technology and some of the stuff that's being invested in some of these other crops and how we're able to produce them in other areas is going to be a challenge for barley. But
yeah, we'll continue. Steve?
Looking ahead the next 10 years, I think it's going to be interesting to see how the buyers, how they want to manage their spatial risk, the one country or, anything like that. For example, in the U.S., if you are contracting malting barley with the growers, you would want that contract program diversified between a Nathan Bowles farm and a Frank Laufer's farm. There's, a lot of ways to measure that. Got an internal system we use mostly grower oriented for trying to analyze that, but it does, take it to, we think a level where you're within a corporation, in some place, malting house, brewing house, whatever, how do I want to manage that risk so that my supply can stay at a steady pace rather than this whipsaw effect that we've got. We kind of like to see the peaks and valleys, flatten a little bit, because it makes it a little bit it's a little bit more predictable for everybody if you can do it that way. But we have to make sure that we have the mindset of procuring ingredients versus trading commodities. There's some relation, but there's some very stark differences in it too. So, how that shifts over the next 10 years is going to be across the supply chain, no question. But it's, certainly interesting to see how we bring stability back across that part of the marketplace.
Yep, that would be very interesting. And the sustainability angle is maybe a differentiator in a way that could be something that gives malting barley a place to differentiate and that we attach that to the supply chain and get away, like decommoditize it. You mentioned,
Yeah.
kind of touched on that. Like, you got to move away from the commodity element, because commodity element's not very fun. And that really underplays all the effort that goes into and I often fall into the trap, because I say, well, North America is a mature market, and that is true from a Canadian and a US perspective, that beer volumes are likely not gonna, maybe they could stabilize and that would be a win. But you're also well situated for Mexico, which I would say is still an emerging market. So so you've got that, and that's where it gets more interesting when you start looking at the layers, because that barley that's being produced in North Dakota, for example, fits very nicely and does today and will continue to go to Mexico. And if that grows, you're just going to put more focus on what you grow. Same procurement people from brewers and maltsters in the U.S. will have to think about how do they compete to stay competitive. Otherwise, that flow is just going to continue to Mexico. So that's one area that I think we could all be a bit optimistic, because the growth prospects are there for Mexico, and that should continue. So that's a big opportunity. One thing very interesting, and you mentioned about everyone should enjoy beer. Working with our friends help us on the event side that are based in Rome. Somehow we got into the conversation yesterday to say, in Italy, if you went for lunch and you ordered a pizza, beer and pizza are the perfect combination. So then I thought, well, that's great. If everyone would order a pizza and live by the Italian rule and only had beer with pizza, we could actually start moving things in a more positive direction. But this food pairing and all these things, but it was just interesting and kind of funny that we had that discussion, which you kind of overthink, but you think that maybe, we have more work to do in food pairing and all those things. But there is
if you like pizza, or I guess you guys maybe you'd add chicken wings to that. there's some opportunities, and those are things you can be optimistic about. I think that would serve us well. So I think normally we would wrap this up and say, well, what's your favorite pint and in your pursuit of the perfect pint? But since we're here together, I think maybe what we can do in Lisbon is just go out and on the pursuit of the perfect pint. It's a bit of work, but I think you guys are up for it. So
I think we could try
give it a try.
Yeah, I think we could give that a try.
Research.
I'm above average.
Market research. So thanks to each of you. Good to see you, as I said. Very good to catch up as always. Looking forward to the contribution this week. With that, let's go pursue the perfect pint.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you,
guys.
Brent.
I think that was really interesting, Brent. And I think that the comments about contracting model really hit home. And I think you were saying when we were talking before the podcast started recording about North America hasn't always been like that in terms of its model of contracting malting barley.
Yeah, it's different. So Canada is still that way. So what the guys described, Canada is still a market, a barley market that farmers grow barley because it's a natural crop for them. So they plant barley without a contract because it's a good fit for them. But your question, in the U.S., 40 years ago, I know I'm starting to talk like an old timer, but yes, 40 years ago, there was a similar model in the U.S. where more barley was grown than was needed. The malting industry could select the best of that barley, and the rest of the barley went into the feed channel and was used as animal feed. That is entirely gone. So in 40 years, that system in the U.S. has gone to this contracting program that the guys talked about. And it's quite important, as they said, it's a commercial deal and it's a transaction. You need it. In the U.S., if you want malting barley grown, you're going to need to contract it. And I guess what I was thinking as we talked about it, Danielle, in some cases, you could look at that as a bit of a crystal ball to what could go in other parts of the world, that as you add regen ag and sustainability and these things,
Yeah.
we would say increasingly you're going to need to enter into those similar kind of contracts because you need to make that commitment to farmers, so then they in turn make the commitment to grow malting barley. And I think we shouldn't, it may not happen in all countries, that's for sure, but I think we have a sign here of what the future could look like.
Yeah, I think America is often 2 steps ahead, or, is the crystal ball of how things might roll out in other parts of the world. I think the other interesting thing for me, Brent, was the whole thing around, do consumers understand what barley is in relation to beer? And I'm embarrassed to say I only found out last week that pecorino cheese is made from sheep's milk. And I'm sure if you ask someone who makes that cheese, they'd be, what? How could you not know that? So I think sometimes in the industry, we get so absorbed in our own little worlds, we think, oh, it must be obvious to everybody. But actually, if you're not in the game, maybe it's not that obvious to consumers.
Yeah, we said it in the recording with the guys. There's consumers that think that milk comes from the store, or your cheese comes from a source different than what you thought. And as we've talked about, Danielle, and we'll test it a little bit as we go out into seeing some barley crops in the coming weeks. If we get a chance, we'll maybe ask a few people when we're pursuing the perfect pint. Do they actually know what malting barley is and what role it plays in that beer? I think we'll be amazed at what kind of responses we get. So I think that'll be important. That storytelling, as I said a couple times in the recording, is important, and I think that's part of why we do this podcast. And I think there's a lot more that we can do around that. So won't solve it, as we said. We won't solve the world's problems in one day or 1 week or 1 year. But I think storytelling and consumer awareness is one area that we can really do some more good things.
Absolutely. And from farmers this week, Brent, where are we headed next?
Next week, the plan is we're going to go back to Europe. So we're going to go as our journey around the world, and we're going to look a little bit again at some of the good stuff that's being done on new variety development, which is also very important to farmers. So yes, stay tuned for a European view to making sure we've got good malting barley varieties for the decade ahead.
Brilliant. And chat next week. Cheers.
Till then, pursuing the perfect pint. Cheers.